Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. Forest that breathes behind me. Scary story published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1. The Whispering Path. The bus wheezed to a stop, its brakes groaning in protest. Elena Foster stepped onto the cracked pavement, her boots crunching against gravel. The town of Black Hollow lay sprawled before her, a forgotten corner of Appalachia where the air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke. A single gas station doubled as the town's diner, its flickering neon sign casting jagged shadows. She tugged her coat tighter against the November chill, her eyes drawn to the tree line looming at the edge of town. The forest seemed to breathe, mist curling from its depths like an exhale. "Ma'am," a grizzled old man called from the diner porch, his voice rough as bark. "You're not thinking about going in there, are you?" Elena hesitated, then forced a polite smile. "I'm here to look into some local history for an article." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The man's weathered face twisted into something between pity and fear. "History? Huh. That forest don't take kindly to strangers poking around. Lot of good folk gone missing in there. My cousin Tommy went in once, back in '78. Never found a trace of him. Best keep to town if you know what's good for you." "Thanks for the advice," she said, her tone clipped. She adjusted the strap of her satchel and walked away before he could press further. By the time she reached the forest's edge, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the skeletal branches seemed to stretch skyward like grasping hands. She took a deep breath, her pulse quickening. This was why she'd come to find answers, to prove her brother's disappearance hadn't been just another tragic statistic. A soft sound broke the stillness, like someone whispering her name. "Elena." Her breath caught. She spun around, expecting to see someone behind her, but the road was empty. The whisper came again, fainter this time, but unmistakable. A chill ran down her spine as a sudden, icy breath brushed the back of her neck. Her hand shot up instinctively, but there was nothing there. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. Yet something deeper tugged at her, an unshakable pull she couldn't explain. Ignoring the protests in her mind, Elena stepped into the forest, the whisper still echoing in her ears. Chapter 2. Roots of Unease. Elena's boots crunched over frostbitten leaves as she ventured deeper into the forest. The air grew colder with every step, biting at her cheeks and stiffening her fingers. Behind her, the faint glow of the town disappeared, swallowed by the thickening trees. Shadows crept across the ground, stretching impossibly long as if the forest itself wanted to hold her there. The whisper came again. "Elena." She froze, her breath clouding in front of her. It wasn't just the wind. It was too deliberate, too human. She glanced over her shoulder, but the path she'd walked had vanished. No trail, no footprints, just an endless sea of tangled roots and fallen leaves. Her pulse quickened. She wasn't lost. Not yet. She adjusted the strap of her satchel and pressed on, her flashlight beam slicing through the shadows. The ground beneath her feet felt wrong. It shifted subtly, like stepping on something alive. The trail she followed twisted unnaturally, veering left, then right, as if guiding her somewhere she didn't want to go. The trees groaned overhead, their branches creaking like the hinges of an old door. A glint of metal caught her eye. She crouched, brushing away the brittle leaves to reveal a rusted compass. Its glass was cracked, but the needle spun wildly, refusing to settle. Her heart lurched when she flipped it over. Etched into the back were two faint initials, J.F. Her brother's compass. "No," she whispered, gripping it so tightly the rusted edges bit into her palm. She hadn't seen this since the day he disappeared. He'd never gone anywhere without it. Suddenly, she was 16 again, sitting cross-legged on her bedroom floor while Jake leaned against the bed, poring over a dog-eared map. "It's just a forest, Elena. People disappear because they don't know what they're doing. I'll be fine." "You don't know that," she'd snapped. "This place is dangerous. People say, the forest, it breathes." Jake had laughed, tossing the compass from hand to hand. "Then I'll breathe with it." Now, staring at the compass in her trembling hand, his words felt like a taunt. "Elena." The whisper came again, louder this time. It wasn't just her name now. It was layered with her own voice, replaying fragments of old arguments, her guilt twisting into words she didn't want to hear. "You should have stopped him. You let him go. You let him die." "No," she shouted, her voice slicing through the unnatural quiet. She spun in place, desperate to find the source, but the shadows seemed to press closer, suffocating her. The whispers faded, replaced by the low groan of the trees and the rustle of unseen movements. Her flashlight flickered, then died, plunging her into darkness. Panic clawed at her chest as she fumbled for her phone, but it wouldn't turn on. The air grew colder, and the scent of damp earth thickened, choking her. When she looked up, the dim glow of dusk had vanished entirely. Night had fallen, leaving her trapped in the forest's endless breath. Elena clenched the compass tightly. She wasn't alone. She couldn't be. Chapter 3, Night Breaths. Elena gripped the compass like a lifeline as the suffocating darkness pressed in. Her breaths were shallow, quick, and she couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The air in the forest had changed. It was no longer just cold. It was alive, shifting around her like a living thing. The flashlight refused to come back to life, no matter how many times she clicked the button. Her hands trembled as she pulled her phone from her coat pocket. Its screen flickered briefly, the faint glow casting jagged shadows across the trees before dying completely. A branch snapped somewhere behind her. She spun, heart pounding. "Who's there?" No answer. The shadows around her seemed to stretch, shifting with every move she made. Tree trunks appeared to lean in closer, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. She staggered backward, her foot catching on a root, and fell hard against the cold, damp ground. "Elena." The whisper was right by her ear now, so close she could feel the cold breath on her skin. She gasped, scrambling to her feet. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out everything else except the faint, mocking laughter that echoed through the trees. "Stop it!" she shouted into the void. Her voice sounded small, swallowed by the vast, breathing forest. The laughter faded, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Her chest heaved as she fought to steady her breathing. That's when she saw the symbols. They were carved into the nearest tree trunk, deep grooves etched into the bark like jagged scars. The markings were unfamiliar, some combination of spirals and intersecting lines that didn't make sense. But they felt purposeful, as if they didn't belong to the forest, but to something far older. She ran her fingers over the grooves, wincing as a sharp edge bit into her skin. Blood smeared across the bark, dark against the pale moonlight filtering through the canopy. The tree groaned beneath her touch, and she jerked her hand back. Further ahead, a faint glow flickered through the trees. Firelight. Relief flooded her as she stumbled toward it, clutching her satchel and the compass like talismans. Campsite came into view, a cluster of old tents, their fabric rotted and torn. A rusted lantern hung from a crooked branch, its dim flames struggling against the surrounding darkness. Supplies were strewn about, dented cans, a ripped backpack, a pair of boots caked in mud. But there were no people. Elena's stomach churned as she stepped closer. The campsite looked abandoned, but not in the way you'd expect. Everything was decayed, as if it had been there for decades, but the arrangement of the belongings felt wrong. Plates sat on a log, as though a meal had just been interrupted. A journal lay open on the ground, its pages waterlogged but still intact enough to show hastily scrawled writing. "Help me. The forest is alive. It won't let us leave." The wind picked up, carrying a chorus of whispers that seemed to echo the journal's warning. "Elena." She backed away, her chest tightening as the wind turned icy, brushing against her face like the forest's breath. The lantern flickered and went out, plunging her back into darkness. Chapter 4. Echoes of the Lost. Elena stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest as the darkness enveloped the campsite. The compass felt cold in her palm, its needle spinning aimlessly. She tried to steady her breathing, but the whispers and rustling branches were relentless. "Who's there?" She called into the shadows, her voice cracking. A low, gravelly chuckle came from the trees. A figure stepped into the faint light cast by the moon, his silhouette ragged and unsteady. Elena instinctively reached for her satchel, searching for anything she could use as a weapon. "Don't bother," the man said, his voice hoarse. "If I wanted to hurt you, you'd already be dead." He stepped closer, revealing a gaunt face framed by a mess of tangled hair. His clothes were filthy, patched together with strips of fabric that looked torn from his own coat. His eyes darted around, wild and unfocused, but they settled on her with a piercing intensity. "Who are you?" Elena asked, clutching the compass tighter. "Gareth," he said, his lips curling into a bitter smile. "And you're just another fool the forest decided to chew on." She bristled at his tone but didn't argue. "Instead," she asked, "what are you doing here?" "Surviving," he said, gesturing to the ruined campsite. "I've been stuck here weeks, months, who knows? Time doesn't work right in this place." Elena's stomach twisted. She wasn't ready to believe him, but the haunted look in his eyes made it hard to dismiss. Gareth moved to sit on a log, his movements slow and deliberate, as if every joint in his body ached. He gestured for her to sit, but she stayed standing. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, running a hand through his greasy hair. "This forest isn't just alive. It's hungry. It feeds on people like us, on our memories, our guilt, our fear. That's why it whispers. It knows what's inside you." Elena's throat tightened, the weight of her brother's disappearance pressing against her chest. "You're saying it's feeding on me?" He let out a dry laugh. "Not just feeding. Trapping you. Same way it trapped me. The same way it's trapped everyone else who wandered in here." "What do you mean, everyone else?" Gareth leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You've seen the campsite. No bodies, right? That's because they're part of the forest now. It keeps them here, just like it'll keep you." Elena felt the ground shift beneath her feet, but she shook her head. "No, there has to be a way out." "There is. Here is." Gareth's voice turned cold. "At the heart of the forest, there's a tree. Ancient, cursed. The cult that planted it believed it could hold onto their dead, and maybe it does. But it's also what makes this place what it is." "You've seen it?" Elena asked, her voice trembling. "I've been close enough to feel it," he replied, his eyes narrowing. "It breathes, just like the rest of the forest. If we destroy it, maybe we can escape." Elena hesitated. "And if it's not the tree, what if destroying it doesn't work?" Gareth's gaze bore into hers. "Then we die trying. Better than staying here, isn't it?" But Elena wasn't so sure. If the tree really was the heart of the forest, It might hold the answers she needed about her brother, and destroying it could destroy any chance of finding him. Chapter 5: The Forest's Wrath. Elena and Gareth trudged through the forest, his paranoid mutterings filling the tense silence between them. Every so often, he would glance over his shoulder, his hand tightening on a crude club fashioned from a tree branch. "The closer we get, the worse it'll get," Gareth muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "It'll try to turn you around, or worse." "What's worse than this?" Elena shot back, her nerves fraying with every creak and groan of the forest around them. Gareth didn't answer. Instead, he stopped abruptly, his head tilting, as if listening to something only he could hear. "Elena." Her heart froze. The voice was unmistakable, clear and desperate, her brother's voice. "Elena, help me." She spun around, her eyes darting through the trees. "Jake," she called, her voice trembling. "Jake, where are you?" Gareth grabbed her arm, his grip iron tight. "No, it's not him. That's the forest." She pulled away, shaking her head. "You don't know that." "Elena, please." The voice came again, this time closer, full of pain and fear. It was so real, she could almost see Jake's face, his pleading eyes. Ignoring Gareth's protests, she darted toward the sound, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly across the forest floor. She barely noticed the roots shifting underfoot until they snagged her ankle, sending her sprawling. "Elena, stop." Gareth's voice was distant now, muffled by the encroaching darkness. She scrambled to her feet, heart pounding as the voice called out again, leading her deeper. Then it stopped. Silence descended like a suffocating blanket, broken only by the sound of her own breathing. "Jake," she whispered. The forest responded with a violent shudder. Roots surged up around her, writhing like living things. She screamed as one coiled around her ankle, dragging her back toward the tree line. She clawed at the ground, the damp earth crumbling beneath her fingers. Gareth's shout echoed from somewhere behind her. "Run!" She twisted around just in time to see him, yanked into the shadows by an unseen force. His scream cut off abruptly, leaving her alone. Panic threatened to overtake her, but she forced herself to move, kicking free of the roots and sprinting until her lungs burned. She didn't stop until she tripped over something half buried in the dirt, a leather-bound journal. Her hands trembled as she picked it up and flipped through its water-stained pages. The scrawled writing was frantic, the words barely legible. "The tree feeds on what we can't let go. Guilt, regret, it makes you relive it, traps you in it." Another page read, "If you reach the heart, you'll never leave the same." The final entry was a single, chilling sentence. "It doesn't want you to leave. It needs you to stay." Elena clutched the journal to her chest as the forest groaned around her, its breath cold against her face. The whispers returned, louder now, a chorus of voices overlapping with Jake's. She stumbled forward, her mind racing. The forest wasn't just alive, it was aware. It preyed on her guilt, on her desperate need for closure. It wasn't just trying to trap her, it was trying to make her part of it. And if she couldn't find a way out soon, it would succeed. Chapter 6: The Heart of the Forest. Elena clutched the journal as if it could shield her from the forest's unrelenting presence. Every step toward the center felt heavier, like the air itself was pushing against her. The ground beneath her feet had shifted, no longer solid earth but a pulsating moss-covered mass that seemed to breathe in tandem with her racing heart. The trees around her were different now. They leaned inward, their trunks contorted and twisted as though writhing in pain. The bark pulsed faintly, glowing in the dim light as if veins of light coursed through them. Each shadow cast on the forest floor flickered and stretched unnaturally, forming shapes that made her stomach lurch her brother's silhouette, the faint outlines of his face. "Jake," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The forest exhaled, a chilling mist rolling through the trees and settling over her like a suffocating blanket. She coughed, her throat tightening as the air thickened. It was as if the forest itself was resisting her approach, each breath harder to take than the last. The journal's instructions echoed in her mind. The heart is where it all begins and ends. Her flashlight flickered, the beam barely cutting through the encroaching mist. She tripped over a root that surged from the ground like a coiled snake, landing hard on her knees. Her palms scrape against the rough surface of exposed roots, but when she looked closer, she realized they weren't just roots. Bone fragments jutted out from the tangled mass, stark white against the dark, pulsating bark. The cursed tree loomed ahead, an ancient monstrosity that defied logic. Its gnarled trunk rose impossibly high, branches twisting together into a canopy that seemed to blot out the sky. Mist seeped from the base of the tree, curling around its roots, which intertwined with skeletal remains and the broken relics of past victims' rusted watches, torn shoes, faded photographs. Elena's breath hitched as her gaze settled on one relic in particular, a tarnished dog tag with her brother's initials engraved on it. "No," she whispered, her fingers trembling as she reached for it. Her mind screamed at her to stop, but she couldn't. The moment her hand touched the cold metal, a deep, guttural groan emanated from the tree. The ground beneath her vibrated, sending ripples through the tangled roots. "Elena." Her brother's voice came again, but this time it wasn't distant. It was coming from inside the tree itself, muffled and weak. "Jake," she cried, scrambling to her feet. She pressed her hands against the trunk, the bark icy and wet under her palms. "I'm here. I'm going to get you out." The tree responded, its branches creaking and groaning as if alive. The mist thickened, curling around her legs and rising to her chest, making it impossible to move. The whispers grew deafening, overlapping in a cacophony of voices, pleading, mocking, crying. "Don't listen," one voice cried. "Help us," another begged. Elena's pulse pounded in her ears as she pressed her forehead against the trunk. The cold seeped into her skin, numbing her. She could feel the forest's pull now, deep and unrelenting, as though it were trying to draw her into its core. "Jake," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "If you can hear me, I'm not leaving you." From deep within the tree, a single cry broke through the chaos. "Don't come closer." It was his voice, but this time, it wasn't begging for help, it was warning her. Chapter 7: Sacrifice and Survival. The air was thick with the smell of rot, the mist swirling around her like a suffocating veil. Elena pressed her palms harder against the cursed tree, the bark cold and slick beneath her fingertips. The whispers had quieted, but they lingered in her head, insidious, like insects crawling through her thoughts. "Jake," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the rising cacophony of the forest. The plea for help was still etched in her mind, but it was different now. That voice, her brother's voice, no longer sounded like a cry for rescue. It sounded like a warning. She stepped back, eyes scanning the grotesque roots that coiled into the earth like the fingers of some ancient, unseen creature. Her heart pounded in her chest as the weight of the choice settled in her gut. Destroy the tree and risk losing her brother's soul, perhaps even her own. Or leave and let the forest claim more victims, trapping them forever in its suffocating grip. She couldn't do it. She couldn't just walk away and leave others to face the same fate. "I have to do this," Elena whispered to herself, her hands shaking as she reached for the flare gun strapped to her waist. The flare was a small hope, a desperate chance to end the nightmare, to end this forest's reign of terror. With trembling hands, she aimed it at the base of the tree, her eyes fixed on the journal's warning. If you reach the heart, you'll never leave the same. She pulled the trigger. The flare shot out with a piercing hiss, arcing through the air before it landed with a sickening crack at the tree's roots. For a moment, everything was still too still. Forest seemed to hold its breath, as if anticipating the inevitable. Then, the tree groaned. The air around her crackled with a surge of unnatural energy. Branches whipped toward her with blinding speed, slapping against her arms, tearing at her clothes. Elena gasped as the roots beneath her feet jerked to life, wrapping around her ankles and pulling her to the ground. The tree's pulse quickened, a terrible rhythm that echoed through her chest, vibrating in her bones. The whispers, once a murmur, escalated into frantic screams, shrill and ear-splitting. She covered her ears, but it didn't stop. "Elena, don't." The voice was unmistakable, Jake's voice. But now, it wasn't a plea for help. It was a command, desperate and commanding, layered with terror. She shook her head, trying to block out the hallucinations, but they flooded her senses, her brother's face, twisted with anguish, pleading with her to stop, his eyes wide and terrified. "No!" Elena screamed, fighting against the suffocating grip of the roots as they tightened around her legs. She could barely see through the chaos. The mist had thickened, and the trees were now swaying violently, like they were alive, with roots and limbs snapping and lashing like serpents. But she couldn't stop. She had come this far. With every ounce of strength she had left, she crawled to the flare, now buried among the charred, smoking roots. She picked it up, barely able to hold on as the forest fought to drag her under. In one final, desperate motion, she ignited another flare. This time, it was closer, right at the heart of the tree's dark core. Fire exploded through the tree's roots, crackling up its gnarled trunk in an inferno of light and heat. The tree screamed, if it was possible for a tree to scream, as the flames devoured it, sending a wave of heat and darkness crashing through the forest. The earth trembled. The forest breathed, louder than ever before, a horrible, angry exhale that shook the very ground beneath her. Then, silence. The smoke billowed, thick and suffocating, and Elena gasped for air, her lungs burning. The ground trembled once more, the final warning of the forest's rage. But in that silence, for the first time, Elena knew she had freed herself. But at what cost? Chapter 8. The Forest's Exhale. The air felt wrong, thick, heavy, and burning with the smell of charred wood and scorched earth. Elena staggered through the smoldering remnants of the forest, her legs trembling, her body drenched in sweat and ash. Her lungs screamed for air, but the stench of sulfur clung to everything. She couldn't remember how long she had been running, how long the fire had raged around her. All she knew was that she had escaped, but the victory didn't feel like one. Forest had given its last breath, and with it, she had torn a piece of herself away. She glanced over her shoulder at the wall of smoke and flame that still choked the horizon. The trees, once alive, with their own dark energy, were now little more than burnt skeletons, their twisted limbs reaching skyward in a grotesque imitation of life. Black Hollow. It had to be a miracle. How could she have made it back? She had been so sure the forest would consume her, trap her like it had done with so many others. And yet, as she stumbled toward the outskirts of the town, it felt like some part of her had stayed behind, lost to the shadows of the woods. The town was wrong. Black Hollow, a place that had once felt small but familiar, now appeared hollow, emptied. Houses stood in eerie silence, their windows dark, no sign of life in any direction. The streets were deserted, the air unsettlingly still. It was like the forest had taken something with it, something she couldn't explain, something vital. People should be here. There should be sounds, life. But there was nothing. Her heartbeat quickened as she made her way to the small cabin where she had rented a room, the place that had brought her to Black Hollow in the first place. It was only supposed to be a stop on her investigation. Now it felt like the last place she had been tethered to reality. Inside, she collapsed onto the worn sofa, the exhaustion hitting her all at once. Her body ached in ways she couldn't describe. Her hands were shaking as she reached for her camera, hoping, praying that there was something on it to explain what had happened, to prove it hadn't been all in her mind. She played the footage. The static fuzzed and warped, nothing but broken images for minutes on end. Her stomach dropped. There was no evidence, no clear record of the horrors she had lived through. But then, there, a single frame. In the middle of the flames, a face. Her brother's face. It was distorted, like a shadow in the fire, but there was no mistaking it. His eyes, wide with fear and something else, anger, perhaps. The flames wrapped around him, but they didn't burn him. They simply held him, encasing him in a fiery tomb, forever captured in the burning heart of the cursed tree. Tears burned her eyes as she stared at the image. Had she just imagined it? Was it some cruel trick her mind had played on her? Or had the forest had it taken her brother? A sound, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. Elena stiffened, her blood turning cold. She turned around slowly, the breath she had been holding slipping from her lips in a rush. The room was empty, but she felt it, that presence. It stood behind her, just out of reach. That coldness that had followed her since the moment she had entered the woods. Her neck prickled as she felt the unmistakable touch of a cold, invisible breath against her skin. No, the forest had left its mark. The whisper was no longer just in her head. She could hear it clear as day now. Elena. It wasn't her brother's voice. It was the forest, its exhale echoing in her ears, a promise that she would never escape. The darkness had followed her.